Like many of you, I've spent the last 36 hours watching the news unfold in real time. I want to speak to you not as a former president, but as an American who has lived through moments like this before. This is one of those turning points that does more than dominate a week of headlines. It can redirect the course of a nation for decades. When I learned that the United States had launched what the administration is calling Operation Epic Fury, a sweeping joint military assault on Iran, and I responded the way I always have in moments of crisis. I paused, gathered the facts as best I could, and began asking the questions every citizen deserves to raise. We were told that hundreds of targets had been hit, including Revolutionary Guard installations, air defense systems, and 9 naval vessels reportedly destroyed within minutes, followed by confirmation that Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, was dead. That is no minor development. It is a shockwave through the global order, and shockwaves do not end with the first tremor. They ripple outward in ways that are often unpredictable and long-lasting. What struck me most was how the news was delivered. The President of the United States chose to announce it in a 6-minute video on Truth Social, rather than from the Oval Office or before a joint session of Congress, and without the solemn weight such a decision demands. We will return to that point, and because the method of communication reveals something about the decision-making process itself. I have been around long enough to understand that when a president sends American forces into combat, the first question is not whether we have the strength to prevail. We do. The real question is whether we acted properly, whether we brought the country with us, and whether we honored the institutions designed for moments like this. From experience, I can tell you that the choices made in the first 48 hours of a military campaign shape everything that follows. They influence the alliances you forge, the legitimacy you carry, and the trust you earn at home and abroad. So tonight, I want to walk through what happened, what it means, and what may come next, and I intend to do that candidly. My understanding of Iran does not come solely from briefing papers, and it comes from sitting behind that desk in the Oval Office and confronting the issue daily. During my presidency, Iran surfaced in one form or another nearly every day. From its backing of Hezbollah to its efforts to destabilize the Gulf and the early signs of a nuclear program, few were ready to discuss publicly. I authorized strikes in Iraq in 1993 and again in 1998, and I felt the full weight of those decisions. But I also learned that the Middle East rarely follows a simple chain of cause and effect. One move often triggers 10 reactions, most of them unforeseen. To understand where we are now, we have to go back to 1979. The revolution, the hostage crisis, and the beginning of a relationship defined largely by distrust and hostility set the stage for everything that followed. For nearly 5 decades, Iran has been labeled a state sponsor of terror. It has financed Hamas, supported Hezbollah, and armed militias operating in Iraq and Syria. That record is widely acknowledged. Yet there was a period when a different course seemed possible. The 2015 nuclear agreement, known as the JCPOA, was not flawless, but it created a framework that included inspections, verification measures, and support from European allies, as well as Russia and China. In 2018, President Trump withdrew from that agreement without presenting a replacement or alternative structure, choosing instead a strategy of maximum pressure and isolation. The expectation was that sanctions alone would force Tehran to capitulate. That did not happen. Instead, enrichment accelerated, the regime consolidated its authority, and the diplomatic window narrowed dramatically. So when I am asked whether military confrontation was inevitable, my answer is no, but it became far more likely once the existing diplomatic architecture was dismantled. That is not hindsight, and it was my view at the time and remains so today. No reasonable person considers the Iranian regime a positive force in global affairs. The issue is not whether it poses a threat, but how a democratic nation responds to that threat in a way that strengthens rather than diminishes itself. In moments like this, verified facts matter more than rhetoric. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated assault described by the president as one of the most expansive and complex operations ever conducted. Targets reportedly included Revolutionary Guard facilities and air defense networks across Iran. 3 nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan, were struck with what the president called a full payload of bombs. 9 naval vessels and related shipbuilding infrastructure were destroyed within minutes. The scale and speed were extraordinary. Most consequential of all, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had led Iran for 36 years, was killed in the strikes, along with much of the senior military command. The president stated that thousands of Iranian military and police personnel were seeking to surrender and requesting immunity. At the same time, 3 American service members were killed in action. Iran responded with missile attacks on U.S. bases in the region, launched projectiles toward Israel, and struck targets in Gulf states, including Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Explosions echoed across the region, and global oil markets reacted immediately. The Strait of Hormuz, a critical artery for roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply, now faces potential disruption. This is where close attention is essential. In that 6-minute video, the president did more than describe a military campaign. He urged the Iranian armed forces to surrender or face annihilation and encouraged the Iranian public to reclaim their country. He openly called for regime change. That final element introduces a new level of complexity, because regime change is not simply a battlefield objective. It is a political undertaking. There is a significant difference between neutralizing a government's ability to threaten you and deciding who should govern 88 million people afterward. History has delivered that lesson more than once, often at great cost. One truth I learned in office is that the way a war begins often determines how it concludes. When a president commits troops to combat, the obligation that follows is profound. Every alternative should be exhausted. Congress should be fully engaged. And those in uniform deserve clarity of mission, sound strategy, and achievable goals. This is not about partisanship. It is about the constitutional design of how a democracy enters war. Article 1 assigns the power to declare war to Congress, not the president. And that placement was deliberate. The founders understood the danger of concentrating unchecked authority in a single individual. In this case, the strikes were carried out without explicit congressional authorization. Members of both parties have said they were not consulted. And there are now efforts underway to force a war powers vote as lawmakers question whether an imminent threat was clearly established. When I authorized military action, I understood that I was exercising authority entrusted to me by the American people through their representatives. Even when urgency demanded swift action, I recognized the obligation to provide substantive answers, not simply a social media address. The communication surrounding this operation deserves scrutiny as well. You're announcing a major conflict, with American casualties and a foreign head of state killed, in a brief online video does not carry the same gravity as a formal national address. The tone, the branding, and the emphasis on credit for military rebuilding raised difficult questions about presentation. Moments like this call for language that unites and steadies a nation. They require reassurance that all diplomatic avenues were truly exhausted. Once bombs fall, diplomacy becomes exponentially harder and more costly. The families of those 3 fallen service members deserve certainty that every other path was fully pursued before their loved ones were placed in harm's way. Beyond the battlefield, there is the question of what this means for our own democratic system. The framers built a structure of checks and balances for precisely these circumstances. They sought neither monarchy nor unchecked executive rule, but a balance between decisiveness and accountability. What we have witnessed is one of the largest military actions in decades initiated by a single individual and announced without prior informed consent from Congress. Lawmakers are now attempting to assert their authority after the fact, drafting resolutions and demanding votes. Yet if inclusion must be fought for only after the missiles have already flown, that says something troubling about institutional health. Consider it this way. If a local mayor demolished and rebuilt a bridge without consulting the city council or holding a public hearing, there would be outrage. Here, the stakes are not infrastructure, but war, lives, and regional stability. This fits into a broader pattern that raises concern: diminished congressional oversight, expanded executive concentration of power, and reliance on social media as a primary governing platform rather than a supplementary channel. When the announcement of war shares a digital space with memes and rumor, the gravity of the moment risks being diluted. Within the Democratic Party itself, there is disagreement, with some supporting the strikes on security grounds and others calling them a war of choice. That open debate is healthy. What is less healthy is excluding elected representatives from the decision before it is executed. Even if the operation proves militarily effective, the precedent it establishes carries weight. Launching a large-scale conflict unilaterally and attaching political messaging to it alters expectations about executive authority. That shift may have consequences long after this crisis subsides. Another uncomfortable question inevitably arises in moments like this. Who stands to gain politically? I will not accuse any president of acting for personal advantage, and I would hope for the same courtesy in return. But when oil prices surge past $100 a barrel, when the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed, and when American lives are at stake, leaders must be able to state plainly that the decision was made solely for national interest. That is a test every president faces, and it is ultimately judged by the public. At the heart of this lies a strategic wager. The administration appears to believe that eliminating the supreme leader, dismantling the military command, and urging popular uprising will produce a swift and decisive outcome. And the logic has surface appeal, yet history offers cautionary examples. Removing a regime can be faster than constructing what follows. Experiences in Iraq and Libya demonstrate that toppling leadership does not automatically produce stability. A nation of 88 million people requires a political roadmap, sustained engagement, and credible international partners. Some NATO allies have expressed concern, and Gulf states hosting American bases have already come under fire. A military strength is measured not only by firepower, but by the depth and durability of the coalition behind it. The possible paths ahead are varied and sobering. In the best case, nuclear capabilities are eliminated, the regime collapses, and the Iranian people chart a new course with sustained international support. That outcome would require years of diplomatic and economic commitment. A second possibility is that the regime survives in diminished form, turning to prolonged asymmetric tactics against regional targets. Oil prices have already climbed, and analysts warn that a full blockade of Hormuz could push crude far higher, affecting households everywhere. A third scenario involves broader regional escalation if allied militias intensify activity or global powers exploit instability. A fourth involves humanitarian crisis within Iran, with civilian suffering and displacement. Winning battles does not guarantee a favorable peace, if the end state remains undefined. Tonight, 3 American families are grieving. 3 service members answered the call and paid the ultimate price. The President has acknowledged that additional casualties may follow. My foremost thoughts are with those families and with every individual in uniform. My concerns are directed not at those who serve, but at the framework that places them in danger. I have long believed that American strength rests in acting through our institutions, upholding our values, and exhausting diplomacy before resorting to force. When war becomes unavoidable, it should be undertaken as a last resort with the informed consent of the people through their representatives. Preventing a nuclear-armed Iran is a legitimate objective. The method chosen to pursue that objective, however, shapes our identity as a nation. Tactical success cannot come at the cost of eroding constitutional principles. That is why Congress must assert its authority. The administration must present a clear and realistic strategy, and citizens must insist on accountability. Our democracy belongs to all of us, not to any single office holder. America's greatest asset is not only its military capability, formidable as it is, but its capacity for self-correction. We have recalibrated before, and we can do so again. No one individual should decide alone when and where the nation goes to war. We owe careful judgment to those who have fallen, to those serving tonight, and to the generations that will live with the consequences. Thank you for listening, and may God bless the United States of America. There is also the question of what deterrence really means in this new landscape. Deterrence is not simply about demonstrating strength, and it is about shaping the calculations of others in a way that prevents the next conflict. If this operation convinces adversaries that the United States will act decisively when it believes a red line has been crossed, that may reinforce stability in some corners of the world. But if it convinces them that American policy can pivot abruptly, without broad internal consensus, it may encourage them to hedge, to accelerate their own capabilities, or to deepen partnerships that counterbalance ours. Deterrence works best when it is predictable, anchored in institutions, and supported by allies who trust both your power and your process. Allies are watching closely right now, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe and Asia as well. They are assessing not just the military effectiveness of the strikes, but the political cohesion behind them. When a democracy appears divided over a decision of war and peace, that division becomes part of the strategic picture. And it affects intelligence sharing, basing agreements, and the willingness of partners to stand publicly beside us in moments of escalation. In foreign capitals, leaders are asking whether this action reflects a durable American posture or a temporary shift shaped by domestic pressures. Adversaries are drawing their own conclusions. They are studying the speed of the operation, the coordination with Israel, and the scope of the targets. See, they are also studying the domestic debate that followed within hours of the announcement. For some, the lesson may be that the United States remains capable of projecting overwhelming force on short notice. For others, the lesson may be that political polarization at home complicates long-term commitments abroad. Inside Iran, the situation is even more uncertain. The removal of a supreme leader who held power for more than 3 decades creates a vacuum that cannot be measured in military terms alone. Power structures in Tehran are layered and resilient, built around networks of loyalty that extend through the Revolutionary Guard, clerical institutions, and economic foundations. Whether those networks fracture or consolidate will determine far more than the initial success of the strikes. History shows that sudden leadership changes can produce reform, repression, or prolonged instability, and it is rarely clear which path will emerge in the first weeks. For ordinary Iranians, the coming days will be filled with uncertainty. Some may see opportunity in the disruption. Others may fear chaos or retaliation. External calls for uprising can resonate with segments of a population, but they can also trigger nationalist backlash, especially when delivered in the context of foreign military action. How the balance between internal reform and external pressure is delicate, and misjudging it can have consequences that extend far beyond the original objective. Here at home, the economic ripple effects are already being felt. Energy markets respond not only to actual disruptions, but to perceived risk, and the Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of that perception. When supply routes appear vulnerable, prices adjust immediately, and those adjustments filter through transportation, manufacturing, and household budgets. Families who may never follow the intricacies of Middle Eastern geopolitics will notice the change at the gas pump and in their monthly expenses. That reality reinforces why strategic clarity matters, because economic resilience is inseparable from national security. There is also the strain placed on military families who understand that an initial operation can expand quickly. Deployments that were expected to be limited can lengthen if counterattacks intensify or if stabilization efforts require a larger footprint. Every escalation carries with it logistical demands, force protection requirements, and the possibility of further casualties. The men and women in uniform will carry out their missions with professionalism, as they always do, but they deserve leadership that anticipates second- and third-order effects. Congress now faces a defining test of its own, and it must move beyond statements of concern and engage in substantive debate about authorization, funding, and long-term objectives. That debate should not be performative or rushed, but serious and grounded in classified briefings as well as public accountability. The War Powers framework was designed precisely for moments like this, when speed and scrutiny must coexist. If lawmakers reclaim their role effectively, they strengthen the system rather than weaken the presidency. The administration, and for its part, has an opportunity to broaden the conversation. Detailed explanations of the intelligence assessments, the diplomatic efforts that preceded the strikes, and the criteria for measuring success would provide reassurance at home and credibility abroad. Transparency does not mean revealing operational secrets, but it does mean articulating a coherent end state. Without that clarity, speculation fills the vacuum, and speculation can be destabilizing in its own right. And we are at the beginning of a chapter that will likely unfold over months, not days. The initial shock has passed, but the aftershocks are still building beneath the surface. How leaders communicate, how institutions respond, and how allies engage will shape what comes next. This is not a moment for panic, nor is it a moment for complacency. It is a moment for steady judgment, constitutional balance, and a recognition that the decisions made now will echo far beyond the immediate crisis.